Unit 6. Individual Differences. Presentation 3. The Psychodynamic Approach to Psychopathology.
The psychodynamic approach is one of the psychological approaches to explaining psychopathology, those behaviours or experiences that might indicate the existence of a mental disorder. Psychologists who subscribe to a psychodynamic view of psychopathology believe that an individual's abnormal behaviour is caused by unconscious forces of which they are largely unaware.
The conscious mind is what we are aware of at any particular moment. For example, our present thoughts, feelings, and so on. In other words, things we are aware of. However, the unconscious is much larger. It includes all the things that are not easily available to awareness, including all those memories and emotions that we can't deal with or are afraid to think of.
When trying to explain why people have developed a psychopathological disorder, psychodynamic theorists focus mostly on a patient's past experiences. In particular, they believe that the majority of psychological conflicts are rooted in an individual's relationships with their parents. Sigmund Freud's theory of psychoanalysis is the best known of the psychodynamic approaches to psychopathology. The first key feature is the belief that psychopathology is a consequence of an imbalance between the id, ego, and superego. These three elements make up a person's personality. The id is the innate part of the personality, driven by a drive for pleasure and a need for immediate satisfaction. The ego is the conscious, rational part of personality, governed by the reality principle, and must operate within the constraints imposed by reality. The superego is the moral part of personality, containing the conscience and a sense of right and wrong.
In mentally healthy people, the ego is strong enough to control the instinctual demands of the id, as well as the excessive moral demands of a superego that is too powerful. In people with psychological disorders, however, the balance between id, ego, and superego is lopsided. For example, some id impulses might leak into consciousness, causing anxiety.
Could you give an example of when that might happen?
Well, imagine what life would be like if our id had total control over our behaviour. We might find ourselves stealing things we want or expressing our sexual urges without inhibition just to satisfy our own cravings. This sort of behaviour would be morally and socially unacceptable, so any such urges are kept in check by the ego. However, once in a while these impulses might find their way into consciousness, where they create anxiety. For example, having an inappropriate sexual thought about a friend's mother and then feeling really embarrassed about it immediately afterwards.
On the other hand, if the superego becomes too powerful, it might create feelings of guilt, which in turn can lead to anxiety or depression. If the superego is underdeveloped, on the other hand, a person might cause harm to others without feeling guilty about their behaviour, something we might refer to as psychopathic behaviour.
The second key feature is that anxiety can be relieved by the use of defence mechanisms. Defence mechanisms are used by the ego to protect us from any feelings or thoughts that would be too difficult for the conscious mind to cope with. An example of a defence mechanism is repression. This involves pushing unpleasant thoughts and memories deep into the unconscious. For example, a child who is abused by a parent may have no recollection of the abuse, but has trouble forming relationships in adulthood.
Another defence mechanism is regression. This means behaving like a child when faced with an overwhelmingly stressful situation in an attempt to reduce anxiety. For example, when faced with a new baby in the family and the possible transfer of the mother's love to the new arrival, a child may suddenly start to wet the bed again.
Defence mechanisms would only be described as pathological when overused. When people rely too heavily on defense mechanisms for dealing with life's problems, this can lead to significant difficulties in everyday functioning. For example, although repression is useful because it restrains dangerous impulses, it also acts as an obstacle to facing and overcoming the real causes of our anxiety.
A third key feature is the belief that many of the underlying conflicts that can lead to mental disorders can be traced back to childhood and are buried in the depths of the unconscious. The unconscious mind exerts a powerful influence on behavior through the influence of emotions that have previously been repressed into the unconscious. Although the patient may be aware of the problem behavior, they aren't aware of the unconscious forces that have caused it.
For example, in childhood, the ego isn't yet mature enough to deal with significant emotional trauma, such as the loss of a parent. The emotions associated with this loss might be repressed into the unconscious as a result. Later in life, further losses, such as divorce or redundancy, might release the repressed memories, causing it to be re-experienced and triggering a bout of depression. The patient is aware of the depression, but not what's caused it.
Evaluating the psychodynamic approach to psychopathology. Freud's view of psychopathology is notoriously difficult to test scientifically. One reason for this is that concepts such as the id, ego, and superego are abstract and don't refer to physical structures that can be observed and measured. This makes it difficult to conduct experiments that might demonstrate the validity of Freud's claims about the causes of psychopathology.
Freud's view of psychopathology is also difficult to test because conflicts between the id, ego, and superego are thought to operate mostly at an unconscious level. This means that there is no way of knowing for certain that they really are taking place.
Despite the difficulty of testing this approach scientifically, there is some research evidence that supports Freud's claims. In 1996, Fisher and Greenberg reviewed over 2,500 experimental studies of Freudian hypotheses, discovering that many of his major claims did actually have some experimental support. However, they didn't include any research on repression or other defense mechanisms in their review. As a result, the scientific status of psychoanalytic explanations based on the use of defense mechanisms or repression remains open to question.
Further research support comes from the success of psychoanalytic therapy. One way of testing the validity of the psychoanalytic explanation of abnormality is to examine the effectiveness of therapy based on this approach. In the 1970s, Bergin and Garfield analysed over 10,000 studies of people receiving therapy for mental disorders. The researchers estimated that approximately 80% of patients who had received psychoanalytic therapy benefited from their treatment, compared to 65% who received treatment from other forms of psychological therapy.
However, before we accept this as conclusive evidence for the importance of unconscious motivation in psychopathology, there is a qualification to make. Bergin and Garfield established that the critical factor in recovery was not the nature of the therapy undertaken, but its length and intensity. The longer and more intensive the treatment, the better the results. Psychoanalysis tends to be both lengthy and intensive compared to other forms of therapy, therefore would be expected to produce better results. This suggests that we should be cautious about taking Bergin and Garfield's evidence as support for psychoanalysis.
So what can we conclude? Psychoanalysis continues to be an important approach in forming the way many psychiatrists think about patients and their treatment. However, its limitations are widely recognised, and it is expected that many important developments in the future will come from other areas, particularly the biological approach.